the Fall River Historical Society, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in our summer series of lectures. And tonight we'll have Dr. Stefani Koorey with a lecture on the historic fires of Fall River. I'm also told that she has some absolutely excellent photographs, so you should enjoy them. By way of coming attraction, Dr. Phil Sylvia, who's here with us on July 27th, will continue his excellent series on baseball in Fall River with the New England League Indians and all-star player Fall River State. Also, by way of coming attraction, we will be presenting under our summer event on July 23rd and July 24th Shakespeare. I think most of you are already members of our Fall River Historical Society. If not, we're always looking for new members, and you'll be able to apply for membership with Dr. Koorey.
Thank you. That'll do. Here we go. Good evening.
Good evening.
Am I loud enough for you up there? Am I loud enough for you over there? If not, just raise your hand and I'll know that means louder, please. So, Historic Fires of Fall River is the name of the book. Come on in. We haven't just started. Please, welcome. This is the book here. I actually show it here as well. It was published this year by History Press. It was an interesting story how this came to be. I did a book for Arcadia Press a couple of years back called Fall River Revisited. It's the Images of America series. And History Press bought Arcadia, and they called me and said, pitch us some ideas. And I said, okay, fire? And they're like, oh yeah. I go, but I kind of don't know anything about that. And they go, don't worry about it, you'll learn. And I did, and I have, and I'm still learning. So I may be imprecise, I may get the words incorrect a little bit in some cases, but I've had some good tutors in this area, most notably retired District Fire Chief Dave Jennings, who's also, I don't think he's here tonight, but he was instrumental in helping me in this book because he told me how fires start, how fires are fought, and how you put them out if you can. He also enlightened me to the whole idea of how to fight a fire and what firefighting is all about. He was present at many of the city's most dramatic recent fires, including the Notre Dame fire and the Borden fire, the Arlen's fire, the Richard Borden Mill fire, and the Kerr Mill fire. Interestingly, I always thought that, hey, a fire truck arrives, it plugs into a fire hydrant, it shoots a hose, and then you just put out a fire. And the firefighters in the room can laugh at me all you want because that's not how it works at all. I was so naive. There are apparatus that do different functions in the fire department. There are ladder trucks and hose trucks and on. And that's been through history. Early fires in Fall River were fought very archaically, and I'll describe some of that to you as well. But this talk is on the historic fires of Fall River, and in this book, they told me you're only allowed 35,000 words. And after 45,000 words, they said you have to stop, which meant I could only include the Great Fire of '43, the Granite Mill Fire of 1874, the Steigerstor Fire of 1916, which many people are not aware of, but was quite destructive, the Great Fire of 1928, which everybody's heard of, and the Notre Dame Fire of 1982. Included in the book itself as a postscript is the Kerr Mill Fire, Kerr Thread Mill Fire. But tonight I also have some video of the Borden Mill Fire, the Kerr Mill Fire, and the most recent Weaver Street Mill Fire that I'd like to share if we have time. As Chief Louis Shea most famously said, Fall River is a city built to burn. Why so many fires in Fall River? New Bedford and Lowell both have mills. of course, but they don't have nearly as many big fires as Fall River has had. And the answer really comes down to a couple of things, but the number one on the list is location. We are on the west side of a hill, a granite, batholithic granite ledge. That's a word that I learned from Bob Kitchen. We live on a batholithic ledge, which was formed during the Ice Age. And this ledge is what's underneath us and we were able to quarry the granite that built many of the city's mills and other structures. So we live on that, and because we're up on the hill and the winds are generally westerly and at times quite gusty, winds have always been an ally of fire. We have many aging mills in the city, of course, many over 100 years old, and they were built for cotton manufacturing, as you know, and they have multiple floors, essentially 100 to 250 feet in length, which are essentially long rooms with 15-foot high ceilings made of wide pine plank floors and that have been soaked for generations with the oils dripped and dropped and spilled from the machinery that was on its floors. So fires in Fall River tend to create their own weather patterns, which I'll explain also. And in certain cases, like the Kerr Mill, that was a retrofitted mill. That was a mill that had been repurposed for multiple uses, multiple businesses inside. But when you slice up a mill like this, you're actually creating voids and spaces in between the walls that you're putting up, essentially vertical holes like elevator shafts. And when fires start in the basement level, which many mill fires do, they just shoot right up as if it's a balloon construction and the entire mill goes in minutes. The balloon framing on our triple deckers also causes lots of fire issues because there are no fire stops between the floors. So, and the insulation that was once pumped into these with fire retardant materials has leached out over time, essentially creating paper within your walls that will not stop a fire, but only help it spread. So Fall River is, once a fire gets started in Fall River, it's very hard to put it out. Since 1813, there have been over 100 significant fires in Fall River. This is just a list of those and the dates from 1813 on. I stopped at the Coughlin School arson fire because that was when the book was due to the publisher. Right after that, that was the last fire, so the other one I talked about is not in there yet. So we start with the Great Fire of 1843. God, of universal providence for wise purposes, on that day commissioned the elements to destroy the very heart of our village, said the Reverend A. Bronson in 1844, the year following the fire. I have to go back a little bit in history to talk about something real significant to the fire of 1843, which is Skeleton in the Armor, which is on May, and this has a tie to not only Lizzie Borden, well, it has a Lizzie Borden connection, let's put it that way. Everything does, so 6 degrees of separation. On May 1831, Mrs. William Cook, whose maiden name was Hannah Borden, aunt of Andrew Borden, father of Lizzie Borden, there's the connection, was digging on the bank of the Quequechan River near present-day Hartwell and 5th Streets for sand to scour her pots. The story goes that a section of the bank gave way and Mrs. Cook was soon staring into the empty eye sockets of a human skull. With the assistance of her husband and clockmaker John Orswell, the skull and its attached skeleton found in a sitting position was unearthed. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was in Fall River in 1840 to visit his brother Samuel Longfellow, who was the minister of the Unitarian Church in Fall River. He saw the skeleton in the armor, they called it that because of the way it was decorated, at the Athenaeum. He was inspired to write a 20-stanza ballad that was known the worldwide, romanticizing the events. He created a Viking tale that celebrates, in metaphor, the history of America. Now let's all say it together. Let's nod and say we did. So you can tell your grandchildren, you actually recited it out loud together in this talk. Here's the skeleton in the armor. Skeleton in armor, excuse me. So let's go to July 1843. That's the month of the fire. Here we have a drawing map of Fall River Four Corners. This is not Globe Four Corners. This is a different Four Corners. This is the Four Corners that was central to the business district of Fall River over the Quequechan River. The map is upside down. It is not pointing north. South is up at top, north is at the bottom. So we're looking at it pretty much upside down the way maps are supposed to go. In 1843, Fall River was still but a town, not yet incorporated as a city, with some 7,000 inhabitants. Fall River was founded 40 years prior in 1803, when a petition was granted for it to separate from the town of Freetown from the north. So this is a little indication of the design of the business district that was pretty much fairly destroyed by the 1843 fire. There was a bridge mill. There's the Athenaeum at the top of the river. It says Post Office and Athenaeum. That was where the skeleton in armor was housed, so people could go visit it. I love this flat rock and cleft rock that they named their rocks in Fall River. They still do, but I don't think these rocks are here anymore. Do you? No, I don't think so. Or I would go visit them, because I do love visiting rocks. I know, I'm crazy, but I love everything Fall River. So, Sunday. Let's move to Sunday, July 2nd, 1843 at 4 p.m. On a very hot, dry Sunday, 2 days before the 4th of July in 1843, and a little before 4 p.m., two boys, who some say should have either been in church on that Sabbath day or under parental supervision, were celebrating the coming anniversary of the founding of the United States a little early with a toy cannon in an open space in the rear of a large 3-story warehouse. The star at the bottom of the screen is where the fire began. That is the warehouse of Abner Westgate, where they were playing in the back in the kindling with their cannon. The temperatures were 90 degrees. There'd been a summer-long drought. High wind, actually, that day. Some said close to a gale blowing from the southwest. Water in the Quequechan River had been shut off to allow repairs in some of the mills. Obviously, this was not the time to go mucking about with gunpowder. So, according to reports, the kindling that was surrounding the little toy cannon immediately caught fire, and in 5 minutes, the flames were 50 feet high. The fire alarm was given at 4 p.m., which amounted to the shouting and ringing of bells. Shouting out loud and the ringing of bells, and the use of speaking trumpets, which were used to amplify voices over noise and the commotion of a fire scene. Remember, this is 1843. We don't have fire alarm systems. We don't have anything close to what we're used to now for protection. The Fall River Fire Department was formally established in 1832, but it was all volunteer. The members were elected under the approval of fire wardens. Attendance was mandatory at fires, and fines of up to 50 cents were levied for noncompliance. 1843, 50 cents is probably quite a bit of money. Members received a small yearly compensation, which amounted to the cancellation of their poll tax. Yes, poll taxes. This is basically what, now this image, this woodcut, is older, of course, than the period we're talking about, hence the wig on the gentleman. But it's the same general description of what the town of Fall River purchased in 1818, the first engine, and it was stationed on the south side of Central Street. It was a bucket engine, and it would spray water with force. So bucket brigades would bring the water, men with buckets, would bring the water from the water source, and they would pour it into the cistern or the tub on top of this machine, this apparatus. And a simple piston pump was operated where the men would be on either side pushing up and down in rhythm. Now, it was operated manually, and these long bars were used to force the water then through the nozzle to spray at the fire. Each up and down motion was called a stroke, and a full up and down motion is called, well, I said was called a stroke. 60 strokes per minute were required to force the water out of the nozzle. 60 strokes a minute. All right. In the very beginning, it was hard to fight fire. So you could only do this job for a few moments, or a few minutes, or 5 minutes until you were exhausted and had to be relieved. Carriages with large numbers of empty buckets would arrive, and citizens had their own buckets made of leather and painted with the names of the owner. This is a speaking trumpet that was used by firemen and captains. This is a picture from another era showing the men with their proud speaking trumpets. Here are those fire buckets. If you have one in your family, I'm sure it's worth $1 million because look at how ornate they could be, how old they are, and how amazing they are. They're usually made of leather and have withstood the test of time because they're fire buckets. Come on. So in 1843, Fall River had the following. They had these engines. They had a suction hand engine, which is the first image, which is like the first image, let me put it that way. A bucket hand engine, which is like the second engine in the middle on the top. A bucket carriage, which I don't think I show. I think that the one on the end is more like the one in the middle. A small hook and ladder truck. Now that is a very small hook and ladder truck because it's a toy, but it would look like that, but not like that, as you know, yes. A rapid engine stationed on 2nd Street, luckily near where the fire started, and it would supply, the one like that was on 2nd Street got its water from a well. And a hydraulian engine, which is like the one on the right. So that's it. So essentially, the only means of fighting the fire in 1843 were hand engines and bucket brigades. This is before and after in a woodcut. Of course, there's no photographs. Way before that. The image on your left, yes, is the main street looking south from Pine Street before the fire. And the image on the right is after the fire, a view of the burned district looking south from Borden Street. And what you're looking at in the foreground are the ruins of the bridge mill, which I showed you in that one Four Corners document. Above them, the ruins of the bridge mill, is the stone church. And to the right, Nathaniel B. Borden Mansion, and in the middle, ruins of the Pocasset House, which was a hotel. Said the newspaper, the Fall River All Sorts, on July 11th, 1843, our post office and custom house are gone, and we have not a printing office, nor bank building, nor bookstore, nor market, nor bakery left. Nearly all of our grocery and provision stores, including one wholesale establishment with most of their contents, and all of our dry goods, druggist, tailor, milliner, tinware, and paint shops, with one cotton factory running 3,000 spindles, are gone. So around midnight, it was finally over with not a single loss of life. Mrs. Seth Durfee, in a letter to her mother, said, "It was an awful spectacle to see and hear the raging, roaring, and crackling of the flames, the rapidity with which they spread, defying all exertion of fire companies. The consternation of the people flying from one home to another beggars description. We do not know where the fire would have ended had not the wind providentially changed just before night had blown the flames back upon the burnt district. Our people are entirely exhausted. I wish you could see Fall River the day after the fire. You could not tell where you were." Major Bradford Durfee, the fire chief warden, died suddenly a week later after this fire. His death was attributed to overexertion suffered in fighting the flames. His young infant son, BMC, was but a tiny tot at the time, an infant, and was alive when he died, but he never really knew his father. So, the Great Fire of 1843 destroyed 20 acres of land. The loss on the buildings are listed here. The loss was so great that the city had to appeal for money from outside interests and sent out advertising and letters to nearby communities and received over almost $51,000 from as far away as Boston and New York City, which was a tidy sum back then, to aid and help rebuilding the city. 1,300 citizens were homeless, 20% of the population. In today's money, it would have been about $120 million in damages, and 200 buildings were burned to ashes. In an effort to express their determination to not let this catastrophe stop them from succeeding as a community, the townspeople erected a banner and hung it in the heart of the ruins. Its message was, "We'll try." That then became the city's motto when it was placed on its first seal in 1854, when Fall River was incorporated as a city, the 11th city in the Commonwealth, and by that time had 12,000 inhabitants. The city's first mayor was James Buffington, a former fire warden and chief engineer of the fire department. But understand this, a year later, our streets have been widened and straightened, and noble structures and elegant massive blocks now appear where desolation so recently held empire. A splendid market and town hall, with 2 more magnificent edifices, which are to occupy the places of the Picasset House and the Picasset Factory, will cover completely the whole territory of our ruins. Besides, 5 houses of public worship have been erected in a superior style. It is true of these that the external beauty and glory of these latter houses greatly exceed the glory and beauty of the former houses. But this is not all. In other parts of the village, as well as in the portion that was scathed by the fire, many, very many houses and stores have been built, and others are now in the progress of erection, so that visitants from the neighboring towns can hardly recognize Fall River as an old acquaintance. And some of our citizens have been heard to say that they find themselves lost at times on their own streets. Indeed, our ruins have been restored, and much more than restored, as if by enchantment. The heart must be a cold as ice that does not glow with gratitude to God on this anniversary of the Great Fire. 1 year later, what's the deal with the Braga Bridge? Somebody's got to tell me, what's the deal with the Braga Bridge? Is it just an employment thing to keep people busy? If they can rebuild an entire town in a year, this will... Okay, I think this will be a recurrent theme with how quickly Fall River seems to rebuild, and yet other things seem to last forever. So that was the Great Fire of 1843, the very first Great Fire of the city. The granite, and no one died, of course, except Mr. Bradford Durfee, Major Bradford Durfee, who died a week later, but not directly because of the fire. Now I turn to the Granite Mill Fire of 1874, which is the saddest story that I could tell you tonight. Because of the loss of life that happened here and the people who died. It was a calamity unparalleled in the annals of this city, and transformed many a happy dwelling into a place of mourning and suffering. The Granite Mill was the 23rd textile enterprise incorporated in Fall River, the first established during the Civil War period in 1863. It was named for the native construction material quarried on its site. Mill number 1, there was mill number 1 and mill number 2. Mill number 1 is the one we're interested in tonight's story. It was constructed in 1865. It was it was located on 12th Street between Pleasant and Bedford. Get that in your head. 12th Street between Pleasant and Bedford. It was 328 feet long and 70 feet wide. It was 5.5 stories tall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. It had a central tower, as you see, was the building's only entrance and stairway. It had a steep pitched barn roof, and the attic area, which is the half floor at the top there, had actually a window that did open onto the roof from the attic. It had a single fire escape located on the east side, but it only reached the 5th floor. The 1st and 2nd floors were weaving apparatus containing 500 looms each and a machine shop. The 3rd floor was for carding and roving. The 5th floor had 64 spinning mules, and the attic area had apparatus for drawing in, spooling, slashing, and warping, and a pair of mules. And it was on this floor that a large number of persons employed compared to the other floors. Granite Mill number 1 had 400 operatives, many of whom were women and children. And now in 1842, Massachusetts passed a law limiting child work days to 10 hours. But it was not consistently enforced, meaning it wasn't enforced. Federal child labor laws weren't enacted until 1938. And in 1874, 45,000 people lived in Fall River. 32% of the adult population, both women and men and women, worked in the mills. So 32% of the entire population worked in the mills in Fall River. And that doesn't count the children. Let's see. On Saturday, September 19th, 1874, at 6:50 a.m., early Saturday morning, a fire caused by a friction spark that kindled some cotton broke out on the north end of the 4th floor mule room at a pair of mules number 15. 17-year-old Dennis Leary, a spinner who had just picked the roller, oiled number 15's mule head, and started the machinery, was there when the fire broke out. Now, the blaze appeared to be very small and extinguishable. Leary attempted to put it out with a bucket of water from a pail of water, one of 100 that were supposedly strategically located around the mill. And fires were put out before with a bucket of water. So it was not an unusual thing for a small fire to break out and then it to be put out by the operator. However, this bucket of water didn't do the job. So Leary turned around and tried to get more water, and in the people that were clogging the aisle, when they finally parted for him to go get another bucket as they stood and watched, by that short amount of time, threads connected to the mule caught fire and almost simultaneously and conveyed the blaze to all the mules nearby, causing flames to form a complete and impassable wall of fire from one side of the room to the other. The flames swept up 15 feet to the floor above. Now, Leary grabbed a hose attached right before all this was going on and before it got out of hand. He grabbed a hose that was attached to the mule alley, and he opened the stopcock and valve and told a man to go down and start the donkey engine to provide a flow of water. Leary passed the hose off and rushed to the valve near the mule and opened it, expecting water to come out. Leary took the hose again and sent the man to order the water turned on. The empty hose in his hands caught fire, forcing him and all of his companions to flee. By this time, all of the machinery was in operation on the 5th floor and the attic. They did not hear anything that was happening below. Here's a before and after photograph. That's the same photograph I showed you before of the granite mill. This is the mill on the other side, burned out after the fire. Half-maddened women operatives rushed hither and thither, shrieking wildly for aid and imploring the men to save them. Some were praying, some loudly lamenting, and some were so paralyzed with fear that they stood as if in a trance, seemingly oblivious to the fate which menaced them, while others stood stock still and wrung their hands in the agony of despair. The fire began on the north side location of the tower stairway, swept along to the south side, so escape down the stairway was impossible. The first alarm was at 6:55 on box 72, but at the same time, it was recorded on box 74, causing trouble on the tappers in the engine houses and delayed location of the fire. The hook and ladder truck that arrived was of little use because the ladder was too short. Bystanders would rush to their houses and brought out bedding, beds, bedding, mattresses, sheets, pillowcases, anything they could to help the people who were now going to have to be jumping out of the windows. This is an actual photograph of the fighting of the fire. This is after, of course, the fire has done its work. I believe it's a photograph of sort of cooling the building down with the water. It's interesting because this is a photograph, and then what appeared in magazines, Harper's Weekly, those kinds of publications, were illustrations from these photographs, but of course made more extreme and dramatic. So here's I believe, where they got it from, with the people running around, the firefighting, this dramatic sky, the fire coming out of the windows. I think those were added for effect. It was probably very much what it looked like, but it had to have been taken from a photograph because you couldn't publish photographs in the newspaper, only illustrations. It was not an ability of newspapers to do. Those who jumped died from spinal injuries, crushed skulls, broken bones. The fire was finally extinguished at 3 p.m. "Throw me out of the window," said little Katie firmly. "I don't want to be burned." So Maggie took her sister in her arms and leaved her to the window to drop her to the ground 65 feet below. As she was about to let go, she observed a woman going down from another story on a rope, and being afraid that she might knock her off, waited, holding her patiently until the woman was safe. Then she dropped her sister down. When the crowd below had removed her, she climbed to the windowsill and jumped down herself without the slightest hesitation. Surely the good angel of the two wonderful children bore them up carefully. The smaller one bruised her breastbone somewhat, and the younger broke her ankle and received several bruises. They both got well. That is a rarity to the story of people jumping 65 feet out these windows. Here's more illustrations of the people jumping out of the windows. It reminds us of 9/11, perhaps, and other instances where people would rather take their chances on a jump than be burned alive. The man on the left sort of looks like he's on a trampoline, but he's not. It's him jumping, and the man is illustrated as dead at the feet. This, I guess, is very close to the woman going down on the rope. This is an image of parents taking their dead children home with them, and this is supposedly an illustration of a man trying to lead the children to safety on the attic floor. Here's a stereoscopic view of the mill following the fire, put out by Gay's Gallery of Art. And here's an image of the inside of the mill, stereoscopic as well, and the damage. I don't know if they're looking for the deceased or if they're just rummaging through the material to see what they could salvage. It's a very rare picture of it in the days following. This one haunts me because of the boy looking directly at us. Operatives blame the managers for a lack of water and escape route. The mill owners blamed the operatives, get this, for not having the presence of mind to warn those on the 6th floor of the fire. for fleeing in fear and haste, and for not helping women and children to safety. The fire department was criticized for not being able to rescue any of these workers or having apparatus that was long enough to rescue people. This is an actual document that is housed at the Fall River Historical Society of a payment made to someone who received injuries in the Granite Mill fire, given $100 by the owners of the mill. Also at the Fall River Historical Society, sadly, are lists of the dead and injured written at that time. So there are actual notes taken by rescue workers, firemen, coroner, of killed and injured. Sometimes they're crossed out when they're found. Sometimes they're added in. It's a working document. So the granite mills were rebuilt, and Granite Mill number 1 was rebuilt. That's it in the foreground. And it was, this is a 1900 view, looking from Pleasant towards Bedford along 12th Street. Number 1 is in the foreground, rebuilt after the 1874 fire. The roof of Granite Mill number 2 is in the distance and was not flattened until 1902. The coroner's inquest called 49 witnesses. The verdict exonerated the mill owners of the fire and the fire department. Granite Mill number 1, they said, was built according to the best practices then in use and with what safety equipment was then in vogue. The coroner's jury, however, did call for significant changes and safeguards in mill construction. Laws and regulations were passed that mill buildings must have more than one entrance and exit, that fire escapes must be made of metal, that automatic sprinkler systems, when they were invented, must be installed and operable. And local laws and laws were passed that the local government was required to make periodic inspections to make sure that the safety was being enforced and everything was operational. This mill complex was torn down in 1962 for a supermarket, store, and retail complex. But it still remained a part of Fall River history forever. Many people penned songs and poems about the disaster. They appeared in newspapers around the country. So it became something that could be sung and actually talked about the fire in Fall River. So the Granite Mill fire of 1874, 23 dead, most of them women and children. The women who were dead were between the ages of 12 and 21. The children were between the ages of 10 and 12. There were 30+ serious injuries. Property losses were $247,000, but the mill sustained $0 because they were insured. See how it's the saddest story ever? Yeah, it really is. It's the only fire that I talk about where there's a loss of life. Steiger Store fire. Yoo-hoo! Interesting. Lots of people don't know about it. How many of you have heard of the Steiger Store fire of 1916? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. 1, 2. You read the book. That doesn't count. 1, 3, 4. All right. Firemen in the back know about it. Yes, it's important. So 1916. Fall River was a happening place. This is a photograph from 1915. Yes, this is your Fall River. How many different modes of public transportation and transportation do you see in this one photograph? I see horses, I see carriages, I see pedestrians, I see trolley cars, I see commerce, I see industry. I see people in suits and hats and dresses. Amazing, isn't it? It was a different era entirely. So this is 1916. Fall River was actually in its heyday. Population 128,000, the most population Fall River would ever reach in the history of the city. It was the largest city in southeastern Massachusetts at the time. 111 cotton mills, 4 million spindles, 37,000 operatives, weaving over 2,000 miles of cotton cloth a day. That's a lot. Including fine and coarse goods and ginghams. Now, there was great discussion prior to the fire of 1816, in the months and years before, that South Main Street really needed to be widened and buildings set back to accommodate the streetcars that are on North Main Street and motorized vehicles that we see here to be operated, so there's a place for them to park, and we need sidewalks, yada, yada. Well, all that changed with this fire, made that entirely possible. And on February 15th to 16th, the entire block framed by South Main, Spring, Pearl, and Columbia Streets were completely destroyed, except for 2 buildings, and it almost took out St. Mary's. Thursday, February 15th, 1916, 11:45 p.m. Near midnight, Ellis Goldberg, a 43-year-old real estate agent, was walking home with friends from the Young Men Hebrews Association. The group had just crossed Spring Street, and just why I chanced to turn my head and look down that thoroughfare I do not know. Almost at the instant I saw smoke, which appeared to be coming from the side door of the basement. A little boy, whom I do not know, exclaimed, "There's a fire, go get a fireman." The star here is the location of the Steiger store where the fire began. Goldberg, the temperature was, it was a very, very cold day with temperatures below 0 by nightfall. It was so cold that the snow from the previous week was still blanketed the city, which helped save some of the buildings in the city, by the way. Goldberg broke the glass on box 12 on South Main and Spring at 11:45 and ran back to the side door of the building, which was the basement window of the Steiger store. He was glad that he had not waited to call the fire department, because what he saw, where he said, were flames shooting up the southwest corner, note that, southwest corner of the basement. 4 to 5 minutes later, the night watchman comes sauntering out of the building and asks, "Hey, what's going on?" He was told that there's a fire in your building, and the man ran back inside. Goldberg said that there was then a very large explosion, and he was afraid that the night watchman had been injured. And then there were several other explosions. Now, this is before fire science. This is before fire science investigation. So eyewitness testimony and accounts are really important for firefighters or fire investigators to understand where a fire starts back then. And so they initially believed that a boiler explosion in the basement had caused the fire. Now, the night watchman's name was O'Rourke. He had a different story entirely. He said the fire was 100 feet away from the boilers in the southeast corner of the basement. I don't know. There's no way to know. They were at odds with one another, before and after. You'll see City Hall's tower, City Hall's iconic image on the left, and again on the right. That's before and after. The Steiger store was a 3.5-story brick structure with a full basement and a sub-basement. Each floor had 10,000 square feet. The store had just opened the year before and still in the process of having its interior decorated with furniture, mirrors, and displays. There were large amounts of general department store stock on the premises, and no working sprinklers in the building. They were incomplete and had not yet been installed. They had been installed but not yet connected to the city's water main. There's an ad for the Steiger store whose motto was, "Your money's worth or your money back." I like that. So hose company number 8 from the Cascade House between Rodman and Morgan was first on the scene. You'll recognize this building, I hope. It's the modern, then became modern furniture, part of modern furniture. The fire doors were, I guess, plugged up with, made solid, but that building is still there. It's still there.
It's a wedding dress store.
A wedding dress store now, is that right? Chief Engineer William Duvall determined a general alarm was necessary to bring out the full force of the fire department, and that was made at 11:54. Now there's Chief Duvall by the big wheel in the back. It's a photo. Now there was a problem. The alarm sounded only 4 strikes, indicating a general alarm, but failed to follow with the number of the box, which is required. So Duvall got upset and worried that they wouldn't understand what was going on, so he drove to headquarters in City Hall, just in case, and directed Captain Jeremiah Sullivan, who was later to be the fire chief during the 28 fire, to telephone all the firehouses individually and let them know to bring everything, and call New Bedford, Newport, and Taunton to bring their people, and they all sent 2 pieces of automobile apparatuses, and the fire chiefs of all those cities attended as well. Oh, let me go back one, because I want to tell this story. So when the Steiger store caught fire, the windows blew out, and the flames jumped across the street. It crossed Spring Street to the brick walls of a 4-story Campbell building. And in the Campbell building was Kresge's 5 and 10, 2 jewelers, 2 dentists, an optician, and the Knights of Columbus. Several young men were preparing to lock up the Knights of the Columbus council room when they were first aware of the fire in the Steiger building. Viewing the fire for a few minutes from the window, they decided that there might be some trouble, so the pool table and some of the other fixtures were moved back from the windows. The danger, they thought then, was probably more to be expected from water and smoke than from fire. Hardly had they gotten out of the building when the quarters of the Knights of Columbus went up in flames, and instead of property being scorched or damaged, as they feared, everything was destroyed. The fire entered through the windows. The awnings ignited, and the fire just came right in. Simultaneously, the blaze stretched to the buildings owned by Emma and Lizzie Borden on the southeast corner of Spring and South Main. So now all 4 corners were enveloped. The Campbell building had fire shutters, but they had been left open. If the shutters had been closed, there is little question that the fire could have been stopped at Spring, and 8 buildings to its north would have been saved. The police chief ordered all his men to work, and they went door to door, rousing residents, including the 45-room hotel of the Lenox, to get them to evacuate. They evacuated Pearl Street, 2nd Street, and 3rd Street. Because the fire spread so quickly, rumor was that there were lots of fatalities, but it's not true. 25 minutes after the first fire alarm, the Steiger store collapsed. Water seemed to make no difference. Flying timbers, brands expanded the fire area and had no effect on fighting it. This is Pearl Street after the fire. Remember, we're 0-degree temperature, so you're pouring water on a building and creating icicles and ice. Great tongues of flame leaping upwards until they seemed to lick the very darkness of the night. Men, women, and children fled with their household goods toward the waterfront. Push carts, wheelbarrows, and everything that could be pressed into service to carry things were utilized. The procession of refugees being scantily clad, some barefooted. Several sick people were carried from their homes, and in some instances, stretchers being utilized, and in others, the beds were taken up bodily. From one house, the body of a man who had died the day before was carried to an undertaking establishment. Belching heavenwards, blacker than the night, it was a scene almost beyond the description of a master. Duvall stationed apparatus to completely surround the fire area and thought that he could stop it at the Cobb, Bates, and Yurtska store on one end, on the north side of South Main. So he directed water onto the CB&Y from multiple streams of the roof, onto the roof and onto the building. The roof was destroyed, the floor caved in, the walls were gutted, but it did slow the progress of the fire. The McWare store, which was further down a little bit, was equipped with exterior sprinkler system that had been turned on early, preventing sparks from igniting the store, and only minor water damage was had, and it was open for business the next day. That's after the fire, that same CB&Y store, Cobb, Bates, and Yurtska, and then everything south. Gone. They feared that the Morris Paint store on Spring Street caught fire. It would explode and all the flammable materials would destroy St. Mary's. So St. Mary's, the religious leaders of St. Mary's were evacuating and taking out all the religious documents and anything that they found important as quickly as possible. And there were actual, fire pieces, flying through the air, landing on it, but they were being put out quite quickly. And there were explosions at the paint company, but they weren't big at all, and the church was not at all injured or destroyed. At 3 a.m., the fire was under control. This is misidentified in the book. This is actually Pearl and Spring looking up towards South Main. You can't see St. Mary's behind the cloud of smoke. These photographs, many of them were taken by a man named Leslie Jones, who worked for the Boston Herald. He came to Fall River and photographed the 1916 fire, the 1928 fire, and the 1941 Firestone fire. His family graciously allowed me to use the images in the book. So they immediately took advantage of the destruction to incorporate a widening of the street. 20,000 people visited the city following the fire, and there were some positive factors. The strong southeast wind at the beginning that had let up, and the snow from the recent storm had actually protected many of the buildings. All the big businesses were rebuilt, including the Steiger store. And Albert Steiger, the founder of the company, arrived at 3 a.m. and set up offices in the Hotel Mellon. He had never had a fire start in any of his stores, and he was very upset and said he would stay in Fall River, that he would rebuild, and rebuild he did. Stayed in Fall River for another 20 years, closing their doors in 1927. Most of the burned area, interestingly, was included in the congested value district of the National Board of Fire Underwriters written the year before. The block burned was exactly that form that was warned to be the most hazardous part of Fall River. The fire inquest said the origin was of a mysterious nature, but not arson. There were no fatalities. So 50 buildings destroyed, 37 mill operatives out of work, loss of operatives. Oh, in the city, I'm sorry. There were 37,000 mill operatives in the city. That's about a prosperity. Loss of other property, 262,000. Population of Fall River was 128,000, no fatalities. The loss is about $1 million in today's money. We had 111 cotton mills and 4 million spindles. So it was a time of prosperity, but it was also a time of destruction. We should do a 7th inning stretch, Bob and Phil, don't you think? Take me out to the ball game. That's next week. Oh, that's right. We're not doing that right now. Okay. The Great Fire of 1928, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Has anybody not heard of the Great Fire of 1928? Come on, Christy, you haven't heard of it, have you? The Great Fire of 1928 raged for more than 8 hours. 348 firefighters, 41 apparatus, 22 cities sent assistance from as far away as Boston. They worked in 0-degree temperatures. $35 million in damages at the time, which is about $490 million in damages today. 36 buildings leveled, destroying 261 individual businesses and 6 square blocks of downtown. 3 hotels, 7 banks, 2 theaters, 1 newspaper building, and several large business blocks. 1,000 people were instantly unemployed, 250 hospitalized, but only 20 overnight. Firefighters had frostbite and broken bones, but there was no loss of life. Yet this was an accident waiting to happen. Crowded old buildings of inferior construction built before the age of modern firefighting preventative practices. There were like fire division walls, automatic sprinkler systems. The streets, even in this area, in some cases were 50 to 75 feet wide and not even wide enough to prevent the flames from shooting from one side of the street to the other. Properly protected buildings equipped with wired glass windows, tin-clad shutters, open sprinkler systems, automatic sprinkler systems on the windows and firewalls were what helped stop this fire. The greatest calamity that has ever visited this city. So, the Great Fire of 1928, Thursday, February 2nd. We're in February again. It's cold. 6:15 p.m. George Sullivan, circulation manager, and William Cooper, his assistant, were just leaving work at the Fall River Herald building. A cold westerly wind was roaring up Pocasset Street as the men braced themselves against the icy zephyr. They happened to glance across the street, and both men noticed a flickering light in the windowless Pocasset Mill No. 2, just one of the 5 voluminous structures between Pocasset and Central that were currently in the process of being dismantled. The light grew more radiant, signaling the escalation of flames. They quickly reported what they saw to patrolman James Galvin, who was walking his beat in the area. The Star is where the fire started. This was such a fast-moving fire with such great wind in its wake, during its existence, that it's very difficult to know exactly what burned first, second, third, fourth, and on and on. Eyewitness accounts only that we can be sure of, but it doubled back many times and changed direction. So it would go from here to there, and then back again, and then head north, and then back down south, and then move around. So things were happening quite quickly. The U.S. Weather Bureau said the early hours, the temperatures were 15 degrees, wind from the northwest and southwest. By midnight, the wind had changed to the north and northeast, maximum wind speed 24 miles an hour. By 6 a.m., it was 0 degrees. The changing winds were the fire's best friend, and they forced the flames back on themselves, creating additional destruction, confounding the firefighters. Sad. So, this is basically across the street from this area. The Central Firehouse was located behind City Hall, 800 feet away from where the 2 gentlemen reported it to the patrolman. So an alarm was sounded immediately. A second alarm was sounded at 6:34. Jeremiah Sullivan, fire chief, called in a general alarm requesting calls be made to nearby assistance. That's Jeremiah Sullivan there in the ruins of the, somebody at the museum was looking for this picture, by the way. I told them I had it. This is a picture by that gentleman I told you about. By 7 p.m., No. 3 Pocasset Mill was burning. It would be another 4 days before the last of the fire apparatus would be removed. The outside apparatus began to arrive as early as 7:45. The Fall River Fire Department had 8 motor pumps, ladder trucks, hose wagons, and combination vehicles. Now, 4 years earlier, luckily, the Fall River converted the equipment that it had for the firefighting to the national standards of hose coupling threads, so that all the communities that brought their equipment, with the exception of Newport, was able to connect directly to our fire hydrants. Newport brought their own adapters, so that worked out fine. But this was really vital, because the hose that was first laid immediately froze to the streets and had to be abandoned. Before and after. Now, City Hall was untouched. It's not in the picture on the right. It is on the right. City Hall was saved by fire brigades from Boston, who stood protection around the City Hall, shooting it with water and making sure that the roof was completely wet at all times. So City Hall was saved. Mrs. Florence Cook Brigham, the curator of the Fall River Historical Society from 1976 to 1990, was an eyewitness to this fire when she was 28 years old. She was born in 1900. Her husband, Richard Curtis Brigham, was a local weather observer for the U.S. Weather Bureau, and his station was at the Mohican Hotel. On the roof, there was a tower. She said, "He told me," meaning her husband, "that one of the firemen said it was going to be a humdinger. I was scared to death. I thought the whole city was doomed. It was terrible, really terrible. The only thing that kept us warm was the fire, but we had to keep moving back as it spread." Interestingly, the Fall River Historical Society's offices and exhibit rooms were in room 45 on the 4th floor of the Buffington building on Purchase Street. The Society's entire collection was destroyed, except for the important items that were housed in a Herring, Hall, and Marvin safe. The Buffington building, however, was deemed rehabitable, and it still exists today. And it says Buffington building right on it. And every time I drive by it, I go, oh, it's still here. So the exact sequence cannot be precisely determined because the wind carried things around. And by 7:40, the Pocasset Mill number 2 collapsed. Flames roared across Pocasset Street. The Herald News building of newer construction had complete automatic sprinkler systems with 32 sprinkler heads near the windows. Exterior cornices were burned and they fell, and the building was singed, but the interior only suffered minor water damage. This is a slide of the Mohican Hotel on the right, the granite block on the left, and the Pocasset Mill behind it. All 3 of these structures were completely destroyed by the fire of 1928. The Mohican Hotel was a part of the Durfee block on the right-hand side of the picture, was built in 1914 and was the largest in the city and could accommodate 500 guests. It only had a partial system of automatic sprinklers on the street and basement levels. The gas company employees moved meter to meter to turn off the gas, and men rushed to save their business records, especially from the Metacomet Bank, which had removed its entire contents before 11 p.m. This is the granite mill. The granite block, the first granite block, not the one you might have been used to later that was built afterwards. But this was the first granite block. It was on fire by 9 p.m. It had 16 businesses located on the street level and 65 others on the upper level. 2 firewalls, however, neither of them reached the roof, so it didn't stop the fire, it just slowed it down a little bit. And 4 hours later, its destruction was complete. But there's an interesting story about this that I thought I'd share. Madame Tussauds Museum of Celebrities of Wax was at the granite block. The manager of this traveling exhibit was very upset that a group of firemen early in the night, because the manager angered a group of firemen early in the night because the manager stubbornly refused to leave when they told him to. He wanted to remain in his ticket booth in case patrons wanted to view the wax figures. Finally, the fire department ordered them to leave, and the firemen, none too gently, removed the wax figures to the street, dropping them onto the ground without thought. Bystanders believed that bodies of victims were being brought out of the building and called ambulances, and rumors of mass casualties were spread around the town. The wax figures there's more to the story, okay? It gets crazier. The wax figures were then carried to the Metacomet Bank and lined up facing away from the street while the manager went in search of a safe place to store them. A police officer mistook them in the smoke and darkness for people and ordered them to move along there, move along, you can't stand here, you need to move along. There's no record of what he said when he found out they were wax figures. That would have been kind of embarrassing, I guess. Maybe he kept it to himself. And hundreds of thousands of people made their way to the city to see the fire firsthand. You could see the glow for miles in the distance. It's estimated that over 250,000 sightseers came to Fall River to watch the fire. Martial law was declared at 12:10 a.m., and at 1:25 a.m., additional martial law was declared, bringing in state police, 4 companies of militia, naval reservists, Coast Guard. This is the east side of the Printers Hall, ablaze on Granite Street, with the Smith Oil Company filling station in the foreground. Amazingly, this gas station located on the corner of Granite and Purchase was not ignited in the Great Fire. Its tanks were under the ground. Fall River had enacted ordinances in 1915, before the Steiger Store fire, requiring all new construction to use fire-retardant roofing materials, but everything was old. There were very few new buildings downtown. This is the burning of the Pocasset Mills around 2 a.m. on the morning of February 3rd. The Great Fire of '28, still smoldering on the morning of February 3rd as firefighters continue to hold it back at the Fall River Daily Globe building. The ruins of the new Wilbur Hotel were sprayed with multiple streams of water. In the smoky background, you can still see the tower of City Hall untouched by the blaze. This is the dynamiting of the buildings so that they would, interestingly, they're dynamiting buildings, but there's people standing around. So this is way before they worried about what happened to you if you got caught in a spot where you weren't supposed to be. In other words, that was your dumb luck. Like, you're the idiot, and whatever happens, that's your problem. So I'm sure they would say, you know, it's going to be a blast or whatever. There'd be an alarm, and people just watched. And of course, there were some injuries, no deaths, no maiming, apparently. Jeremiah Sullivan declared it under control at 2:30 a.m., and as I said, it was 4 days later before the last fire apparatus was removed. It just resembles a war-torn European city to me. It doesn't even, it looks like something from the Blitzkrieg, or bombs must have caused this. This is where it was stopped at the Fall River Daily Globe. There was a firewall there, and it prohibited the fire from going much farther. This was, this was the new Wilbur Hotel. Now it's the not Wilbur Hotel at all. A City Saved by a Thread depicts the fighting of the Great Fire of '28, a magazine advertisement from Capital Stock Fire Insurance. And this is what showed up once the Pocasset Mill was moved away and burned down. We had waterfall. There are 8 waterfalls on the Quequechan River in the last half mile of its course to the Taunton River. Now it's in a pipe. I have some video of the fire itself. Actually, it's not of the fire itself, excuse me. This particular video is of the dynamiting of some of the ruins. I won't show it all. It's like 8 minutes of dynamiting, which can get really tedious after a while, but when you first start seeing it, it's quite dramatic. The dynamiting happened in the days following. Not right away. The safe companies came to town, of course, to do advertisements that their safes, which were more than, I think, 128 different safes, were safe. They opened them up and the stuff inside was fine. And so the safe companies were all very excited that their fire safes worked. It was a true test of their product. And we're talking bank safes, business safes, historical society safe. This is of the fire itself, shot by an Italian film crew that I found, strangely. Pretty darn cool, huh? Very clear. Too bad that's it. I mean, that's all I've got. I'd like to see more. It's like there must be more. The time code tells me so.
Do you know why there was an Italian film crew there?
There were film crews at all the major fires that had film, when there was film production available, that were there filming right away, and then the next day you could go to the cinema and see film of the fire in Fall River. They were actually producing commercial film of fire that you could see. Yeah. Safe company. Yay, look at our safe. Everything's okay here. Now, here's a series of images. Looking down, these are from a PD boarding collection from the Fall River Historical Society. Looking down Pecasset from City Hall on the left, Fall River so there's the Herald News building. That's where the Pecasset mill was. And on the right, you're looking a little bit more to the right, the ruins of the granite block and Pecasset mill from City Hall. And then a little bit more to the right at the ruins of the Mohican Hotel from City Hall. So that was kind of three in a row, almost a panorama from the top of City Hall. The best story from the fire, however, concerns Judge Frank M. Sylvia, Justice of the 2nd District Court and Fall River Mayor Harry Monks. Judge Sylvia, attempting to get into his chambers in the courthouse in Rock Street, was ordered back by one of the National Guardsmen. Explanations by the judge did not do any good, and the youth was adamant. He had his orders, and he was going to obey them. The judge turned away and went looking for Mayor Monks. He explained his predicament to the chief executive, who said, "Oh, that's all right, I'll get you by. Incidentally, I think I'll drop into the courthouse with you for a little while. I've got some things I want to talk about." The two walked back to Rock Street, where the young man smartly came to Port Arms. "You can't get there," he said. "You can't get by here," he said. Mayor Monks made a conciliatory gesture. "Now listen," he said. "You've got to use some reason in all things. This is Judge Sylvia, and he wants to get into the courthouse. Surely he ought to get by." The young guardsman thought it over for a few minutes and then decided to relent. "All right," he said, "that sounds reasonable. Go ahead, Judge." Judge Sylvia started past the deadline, and Mayor Monks fell in step. "Just a minute," said the youthful soldier to the mayor. "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm going to the courthouse with the judge," said his honor. "Oh, no, you're not," said the youth. "Young man," said Mayor Monks sternly, "do you know who I am? I am the mayor of this city." "Oh, I know that all right," but the guard pointed toward the southwest. "City Hall's over there." We have the direct descendant here tonight that will confirm that this actually happened. This is Phil Sylvia's grandfather, right? Judge Sylvia. Small town, yes. Recently, some photographs by Walt Coolidge found their way to the Fall River Historical Society, and they graciously allowed me to scan them and share them with you tonight. Walt Coolidge was a photographer for the Fall River Herald News. These are from his personal collection. These are some of the photographs that have appeared in books worldwide about the fire, but some you have never seen before. This is looking down on the bank roof from City Hall. This is looking north, up North Main. You'll see Durfee High School at the very top of the photograph. Isn't that Durfee? Yes. The Buffington building is not this building here that's all burned out. I think it's the one in the next block there. I don't know what this building is, and if anybody does know, let me know.
I think that's the bank.
A bank, it almost looks like a church. It has stained glass or cut glass windows. It does, but there's no churches that burned down, and the synagogue was not in this location, and it was destroyed, but it wouldn't have looked like that. It was all wooden. Again, Europe, World War II. That's a striking photograph. Still smoldering. This man had a good eye, did he not? Composition with the shadow of City Hall. This was where the first fire alarm was called in. Now, loss of paperwork proved to be a stroke of good luck for one Brooklyn woman. Mrs. Catherine Barretto, 26, formerly of Fall River, was to be the first woman in New York State to be sentenced to life in prison under a new law for her 4th robbery conviction. The first 3 occurred in Fall River. Her records were burned. So the first 3 could not be proved. She ended up serving 5 years instead. Good for her. Can you imagine life for 4? Yeah, right. 18 months later, all of this destruction and ruin had been cleared and rebuilt. 18 months! Braga Bridge! I give you the Braga Bridge! Ugh. Mayor Monks announced, here's the thing that you don't know, but Mayor Monks announced that the city would build a park out of the ashes. And the fire debris was taken to Globe Pond and filled in to make a park, which is now Father Kelly Park. Underneath Father Kelly Park are the ruins of the 28 fire on the site of the first mill from 1811. Pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool. Destruction, 36 buildings, 261 individual businesses, 6 square blocks, 3 hotels, 7 banks, 2 theaters, 1 newspaper, several building blocks. No loss of life. 8 hours. 125 safe. Last fire. Can you take another one? Are you sure? All right, take a breath. The last one was in 1928. This was in 1982. Interesting. The most emotional loss that the city has ever experienced. 235-foot copper-sheathed twin spires collapsed. 100-foot wide, 235-foot long structure crumbled to the ground. Emergency evacuation of 75 neighboring families. The newspaper the following day led with the headline, "The Day the City Wept." Interestingly, the 1893 original wooden church on this site also burned down from fire of suspicious origin. I won't go into great detail about the Flint affair. We don't have time ever to talk about that. It's much too complicated, but it's in the book. It's worth reading. Pulled that mainly as a source from Phil Sylvia's dissertation, which he won't publish, which I insist that he do. But I want you to know what was in this church that you might not know. You probably do. It took 3 years for Ludovic Cremonini to paint the murals on the ceiling. The Last Judgment was in 8 sections, 75 foot long and 50 feet wide. Took him 3 years. The organ had 3,000 pipes with 70 voices. Wood and metal ranged in size from 7 inches to 16 feet in length. There was a 9-ton set of 20 bells installed in the south steeple, and each bell was given a name, the largest being Marie, maiden after Mary. The wooden floors were made into terrazzo, and 13 stained glass windows measuring 7 feet by 27 feet were included. It was said by some, walking into this church was like walking into heaven. I tried to find some slides of the church before. At the time of the fire, the church was undergoing $1 million renovation. This is the construction of the spires in 1924. There's a man in there. Yes, there's a person in there. It towered above the city. There's an image of the Criminini Last Judgment at the top, in the ceiling panels, and I'm sorry, the Last Judgment is straight ahead, and then the ceiling paintings. Tuesday, May 11th, 1982, at 2 p.m., Roland Massey. Are you here, Roland? I don't want to say, he's still alive. I didn't know. Is he here? No? Okay. Church sexton was closing the church windows around 2 p.m. when carpenters from the Universal Roofing Company of New Bedford, who'd been working on repair and replacement of copper gutters on the roof of the church, rushed into the building with horrible news. They said, "You've got to get up into the attic. There's a fire in the attic." Well, we didn't know how extensive the fire in the attic was. The first alarm was called in at 2:25 p.m. from an on-site office trailer for the Eastern Construction Company. A second call was made shortly thereafter. Did you understand that at 2 o'clock they were told that there was a fire? And that the first call came in at 2:25? Remember the man from the Steiger store who said, "I'm really glad I called it in right away before going to look"? In fact, the chief of the fire department, Louis Shea, at that time, blamed the lateness in calling the fire department, not for the destruction of the church itself, which would have happened probably, but for the destruction of the nearby houses and triple deckers that could have been protected had the fire department arrived sooner. 350 firefighters, 34 fire departments, 50 fire engines, 6 ladder trucks. Before and after. Said Chief Shea, "I was really worried. Did we get everybody out? Was there anybody we didn't know about in any of those houses? Was there a blind person or a deaf person somewhere in any of those houses? It was frightening to even think that we might have missed someone. Think about it. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. Had it been 2:30 in the morning, we would have lost 20 to 30 people." Fires started when the wooden fascia board behind the gutters ignited during construction work. The flames spread across the roof of the church and onto the twin steeples, soon toppled onto the roofs of the building next door. They say it spread faster than you could run. Chief Shea said it took 1/2 hour to level a church that took 16 years to build. Strong winds were blowing from the north down, spread the fire towards Pleasant Street. Low water pressure in some of the hydrants, and some faulty hydrants, and some communication problems were present that day. The heat was so intense and the wind was so strong that it created its own weather system, a firestorm, a vortex of wind and flame. As heat from the fire drew in more of the surrounding cool air, an updraft was created. Firestorms are not material itself burning. Its intense heat sucks massive moisture out of material, making them more vulnerable to ignition by embers or firebrands, increasing the rate of fire spotting. Shea said the delay in calling in the fire was crucial. The fire was made more considerable headway in the loft area before they were called. He said there had been probably an hour of pre-burn where wood behind the gutter could not have been exposed for a while, could have been exposed for a while to the heat generated by the soldering. In such a case, a chemical decomposition of the wood begins, the ignition temperature is steadily lowered, wood starts to glow, and sets up a fire stage of flaming combustion, the visible fire itself. By late afternoon, the church was a burning granite shell, and the apartments nothing but smoldering rubble. The fire in the body of the church was already abating now, and everything combustible had been consumed. But it took one last wild and frightening turn when the elaborate twin towers succumbed to the flames, crashing and tumbling down, first the south, then the north. Spectators shrieked and cried. No one was remotely near the collapse zone, and no lives were lost, but the psychological trauma and the symbolism of that fine, violent spasm horrified neighbors and parishioners. No loss of life. 50 million in damages, 20 million just from the loss of the church, 12 commercial buildings damaged, 29 frame buildings damaged, 3 residential damaged, 29 frame buildings burned, 109 apartment buildings burned, 300 homeless. Now, I don't think you need to see this, so I'm going to skip over it, but it's the Richard Borden Mill fire, because I would rather show you something else, which you've seen this before, because you were there. The Kerr Mill thread fire, this is crazy stuff. I'll show you a part of this. Because I've never seen this before. I just found this yesterday. This was a fire that was so hot it melted the road. It melted the paint off of passing cars. asked to call the Fall River Historical Society, find out how old the building is. There's one small scene I want you to see where the fire hose is on fire from the heat. There. Because the road is melting. The asphalt on the road is melting from the heat. That's fire hose on fire. And it goes on like that. It's just so. This is a very short film of the recent Weaver Street fire that someone shot. Modern technology and modern filming techniques are so amazing. There's actually one on there that shows the ruins from a drone that somebody had a camera attached to it and flew over it. It's just sort of mind-bending. But this just happened this year. Cause of the fire unknown, possible arson. People were seen fleeing the area, youths, on a camera across the street at the health club. And my friend did not wake me up to tell me this was happening. And I'm like, I just wrote a book about fire, and it's happening, and I would, I don't want it to happen, but I want to see it if it does. So any of you, let me know. I mean, I think it's different than being there in person than, of course, watching a video of it. Now, I really don't want to leave you with all of that sadness. I need to leave you with this.
Okay, everything okay? Just take a deep breath. It's gonna be okay. I'm gonna run inside and sweep the house. All right, be right there. Just take a deep breath, calm down a little bit.
Well, I'm sorry, but if my house is gonna burn down, I want it to be clean.
You don't have time for this.
Please, I'm off. I'm off.
Oh, she in the house. No. I'll check again.
Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie, Mitch. I wanted to make sure my husband had some fresh black and
Skip, we don't have time for this. Yeah, enough with the quackness, right? We don't have time. Let's go this way. Später.
Hello, Papa. Hi, Peter. You never know if whose house is on fire. Goodbye.
Back in here, okay? Just stay outside.
Hello, Mr. Fireman. Okay.
What's going on? Getting too old for this. Sit down, come on, let's go.
Come on.
You need to stay out. Oh, man. Oh, that was a tough one, man. Hey, what? Where is she? Oh, come on. Why did she get back in there?
Okay, everybody relax. Relax. Okay, take it easy. There's no fire. There's no fire. Oh, I just burnt my prescription.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions that I can possibly try to answer, but chances are I won't be able to? Yes. Well, it's interesting. I think did I mention the 45,000 words to you guys? I've showed it so many times. They made me stop at 45,000 words, and I couldn't include the fire. I have all the research for it. I'm ready to go on it, but it couldn't be included. It's too big of a story to rush. It's an interesting story. There's lots of great images. So yes, I have the information. It just didn't make it into the book. Hopefully, that's another project. I understand there's someone else who's interested in possibly doing a book on that, and maybe we can hook up on that. So, yes.
They've converted several of the old buildings into housing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they're going to do that one that's down by the water. They're going to do the top 3 floors for housing.
Mm-hmm.
And those oil-soaked floors, I would never live. I owned one of those buildings.
Yeah, you owned a hat factory, was it?
No, I owned a clothing factory.
Clothing factory.
I was in the last granite mill built in Fall River. And those floors were soaked for 50 and 60 years with oil.
Mm-hmm.
When they get on fire, they don't put it out.
Well, because of the technology, the fire safety technology involved in the new retrofitting of buildings like this, there are every safeguard in place to try to make sure that they don't catch on fire, that the oil-soaked floors are less the problem than the way the fire spreads up from the basement up. And they normally happen in basements. And then once the fire gets raging, and it hits the bottom of the floor below, then it gets hotter and it goes up that way. So I understand what you're saying. I don't know if I would. I think it'd be cool to live in one, but I also would worry, as you might as well. I imagine insurance would be incredible if you lived in one. Yes?
Kind of a funny story about the Kermo fire.
Yeah?
The day after, there was a news crew, of course, on the westbound side of 195. Some of the houses there, the aluminum siding melted.
Yep, melted. Yep.
While the crew was there was somebody climbing out of a window. They caught somebody breaking into a house.
Oh, my goodness.
I don't know if anybody here remembers that.
Oh, my goodness.
But,
Yes, taking advantage of other people's misfortune and then getting caught, yeah. That'll happen. Anything else? Well, thank you so very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the talk on the history.